Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec. Today, I want to talk about contradictions. We've all heard of combos, two or more cards that combine in such a synergistic way that it can lead to wild amount of value, potentially even infinite loops if you are doing an infinite combo. Combos are cool moments where two or more cards combine to become more than just the sum of their parts. Sometimes, though, you run into a nonbo, which is perhaps a less obvious piece of jargon. It's something that we've been asked about here and there, but a nonbo is basically just the opposite of a combo. It's a moment where you have an anti-synergy, times where the cards don't interact well together. Sometimes this is because of an unintuitive rules error. For example, in the past on this channel, we've challenged the stats on cards like a Library of Leng in decks such as Anya Falconwrath or Infaldorn. Library of Leng's ability helps you protect the cards that you discard by putting them back on top of your deck instead of sending them to the graveyard, but only when those cards are discarded as part of an effect. Reading carefully, Anya and Faldorn require you to discard a card as part of the cost of activating an effect. So that's something that wouldn't actually end up giving you the benefit that you want, and something that we've labeled as a nonbo. The other, and perhaps even more important thing that we would call a nonbo, are the times when your cards stumble over each other. For instance, if your dinosaur deck has life gain effects, such as Verdant Sun's Avatar, but your own Rampaging Ferocidon says players can't gain life. Or if you have an Immortal Sun in play, giving you tons of cool benefits, but shutting off the 2 or 3 planeswalkers that your deck happens to run. Those are more strategical nonbos, which can sometimes prevent you from fully enacting your strategy to the best of your ability, and on occasion, losing those little edges can cost you a game. Generally, when we discover a nonbo in our deck, we yoink it right out of the list, right? Sometimes we don't notice them during the deck building stage, you only manage to discover them during an actual game. And at least for me, I tend to swap them out at my earliest opportunity because I don't like seeing a thing that makes my deck feel like it's fighting against itself. At least I usually do that, but there are some exceptions, and they're kind of interesting, which leads me to the question that I want to ask you. Do you have any acceptable nonbos in your lists? Or are there any anti-synergies that you still play anyway? For example, lots of equipment decks know the struggle of Shroud. Lightning Greaves is a terrific piece of tech, one of the most popular cards in the whole format, but Shroud makes it hard to attach more stuff to your own creature, because unlike Hexproof, you can't target a thing with Shroud either. But Lightning Greaves is so good at protecting your super important Voltron that sometimes you're willing to bite that bullet, right? And hopefully you're even able to get another creature into play that the Greaves can temporarily switch onto, so that then you can freely equip up your Voltron and then slide those Greaves back over. So even though this card does get in the way of some of the other cards in your deck, the card itself is still so good at its job in other ways that it's not worth it to cut, and you may still want to play it. Or equipment decks can sometimes struggle with the popular Swords of X and Y, which grant protection from whole colors, only to realize that, that now makes it impossible to attach this colored equipment, such as an Embercleave, to that protected creature. But individually, those swords or that Embercleave might be so powerful for your strategy that maybe you still end up wanting to run them all anyway. Even if they don't combine together, when you have just one of them in play, you still feel pretty good, so maybe you don't feel like you absolutely must take one of them out of the deck. I certainly have a few nonbos in some of my own decks. I play Haunted One in my Barakos party deck, for instance, because the background will pump up all my creatures for a bigger attack. Haunted One also grants Undying, which will resurrect my creatures if they don't have +1 counters on them, which makes me really feel like I can be aggressive without risking the life of my party creatures. However, also in the deck is Nalia de Arnis, who gives out +1 counters when I have a full party. Those +1 counters would contradict the Undying, but I still like both of those cards. Or in that deck, I have a Vexilus Praetor, a warrior with flash that protects my commander. It fits so well into what that deck wants to do. But it also causes things like my multi-class Baldric to fall off of my commander, or it prevents me from targeting my own commander with important cards like Baldan, one of my favorite win conditions in that list. But in all of those cases, from the Vexilus Praetor to the +1 counters to the Undying, each of those cards feel individually useful enough that even if they don't all 100% cooperate with each other, I'm glad to play them. I'm happy to use them to help out such a funky strategy. Frankly, nonbos can be really hard to avoid. Crux of Fate, for example, shows up in 80% of Ur-Dragon decks, a fabulous board wipe that ends up being one-sided, keeping your dragons alive. But it'll blow up your own Dragonspeaker Shamans and Rivaz of the Claws, won't it? And yet, 2/3 or more of Ur-Dragon players are still using those extra creatures in their deck, along with tons of other humans and goblins that help out the dragon strategies too. Because those little non-dragon minions are totally worth it to help out that strategy. And that Crux of Fate is also totally worth it too. I kind of run into this similar situation in my zombie deck. I play stuff like Kindred Dominance to destroy all non-zombies, and my Zombie Apocalypse spell even kills all humans. And because of those spells, I do try to limit the number of non-zombies that I play in the deck, but I still can't help myself from playing Species Specialist in that list, even if my own spells sometimes eliminate it. I'm just a sucker for all of the cards that it can draw, so that's a Nonbo that I'm okay with, an anti-synergy that I'm willing to deal with because the benefits outweigh that sacrifice. Or here's another example. According to EDHREC, over a quarter of Pier and Toothy decks run Mystic Remora, a super popular and fantastic source of card advantage in blue, but one whose cumulative upkeep counters will be affected by Pier's ability, so you end up having to pay a lot more mana to keep that enchantment alive than you would in other decks. That looks like a bit of a Nonbo to me, a pretty risky proposition. But for those Pier and Toothy players, perhaps they found that the risk is worth it to get all of those juicy card draw triggers, and mayhaps their deck is even so much more focused on Toothy than it is on Pier that they'll have more reliable control over how often they would run into that potential Nonbo in the first place. Sometimes just by the way you play a certain strategy, perhaps a pitfall isn't as bad as it may look at first glance. Or heck, just think of how many decks out there run Graveyard Hate and also Graveyard Recursion. Scavenger Grounds shows up in 125,000 decks, and 32% of green decks playing Scavenger Grounds also play Eternal Witness to help get things back from their own grave. Or nearly 10% of decks that are running Rest in Peace also play Savin's Reclamation as well. I wager those players feel that the cards are good enough to justify running alongside each other because the cost of not playing the Graveyard Hate cards could be, well, I just lose the game to the Graveyard deck, and having that silver bullet is worth losing one of your own recursive spells to guarantee that you don't get ousted by a Reanimator deck across the table from you. In fact, to put a competitive spin on this for a moment, a full 54% of decks that play Collector Oof are in fact playing both Collector Oof and Dockside Extortionist. Even though Oof shuts off Dockside, having that card able to stop others from an infinite loop with their Dockside is worth it for the times that you won't get to do your own infinite Dockside combo. So that brings me back to my question, are there any Nonbos hiding in your deck that you still play anyway? Where and how do you draw the line between this card hurts my strategy and but it's still worth it? That's not a simple question to answer, and in fact it's sometimes pretty easy to trick yourself into thinking that something is worth it when really it might not be. And of course, sometimes you don't even care about Nonbos, right? You just like those cards anyway, and playing what you love always makes it worth it. Genuinely, the fun factor is a big thing to pay attention to. When I encounter a Nonbo, I want to ask myself if it reduced my enjoyment, and if it did, then that's the moment when I'm likeliest to yoink something out of the list. But if I drew those cards and realized that they had that anti-synergy, but each individually they still make me smile when I draw them, then I don't know, maybe I'll give them a pass. But if I'm putting the silliness stuff aside and I am just trying to focus on things through a lens of does this card actually help me win or not, then maybe the questions become more like, did this draw cost me the game? Would something else in this card slot have helped me clinch victory in that moment? Would something else in this card slot not have produced that contradictory anti-synergy? And if that's the case, maybe I'd want to swap that card out for one of the other many hundreds of cards in my maybe board that I also really want to try out. Most often though, I find myself thinking about the ripple effects. As discussed on this channel before, sometimes just changing one card in your deck isn't just changing one card in your deck, because it has a huge domino effect on the rest of the synergies throughout your entire list, affecting the efficacy of a whole bunch of your other cards. If one card is the culprit in more than just one Nonbo, then yeah, maybe taking it out would have a whole bunch of positive ripple effects. But if taking that card out would actually lessen the support for a ton of other cards that need the effect that that card provides, then maybe those domino effects are more important to consider. So weighing those ramifications against each other becomes the goal for me. Most of all, I think this is really important advice to keep in mind when you're looking over another person's deck list, because they might have a Nonbo that they're not aware of, but they might have a Nonbo that they're very aware of, and it's through the way that they're playing that deck or the sacrifices that they're willing to make that will actually make that card shine more, even if it initially doesn't look like it should shine at all. Just like not all combos produce the same end result, not all Nonbos should necessarily be weighted the same. If a card Nonbos with my commander, the thing that my entire deck is built around, then that feels to me like a much bigger problem than if a card happens to be a Nonbo with another thing in the 99. Because it's possible that during a game I may not even draw both of those cards and end up with both of them in play anyway. So those are things that maybe I might end up giving a pass to if individually they both really enhance that commander strategy and if they end up being a whole lot of fun to play. As much as we want to avoid having any Nonbos in our list and we only want to find the coolest of cool synergies, when we encounter those Nonbos, they actually reveal something hugely important to our deck building and to our strategy. They force us to ask what we're willing to sacrifice to help keep opponents from taking off with strategies that otherwise we wouldn't be able to stop. They force us to ask ourselves how important those effects are to our deck strategy. Is it really super necessary to protect our commander this much? Are there certain card draw spells that we do want to use even if they would contradict some of the other cards in their deck? How important are those things to our strategy, and what sacrifices are we willing to make sure that the deck can flourish? But now I'd love to hear from you about how you go about making these weird decisions, because they're very tricky, and learning how to play around them is a really cool way to level up your EDH game. So sound off in the comments below, like and subscribe to appease the YouTube gods. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.